Okay, greetings everyone. Van and Vivian here. We're about to continue now in our study of this epistle of Paul, the apostle, to those in Rome. And we are going to pick up here in chapter 11. And chapter 11, there's a very definite turn in audience to the Gentiles. And our focus is going to be on verses chapter 11, 13 through 36. Now we have already dipped into these verses, but haven't gotten nearly as far into the balance of the chapter as we intend. So we're going to see what we can accomplish today. Now, however, having said that, before we actually go right into the study, we thought we would spend just a few moments with what we'll call as a brief tutorial on rules necessary to understand a written text. You may notice that we have been trying to pay attention very much to the text. I don't want to be sharing what I think or what scholarship thinks. We'd like to go with the authority of the text itself. That means I need to pay attention to some things. So, and understanding a text, especially the King James Bible text, is a bit of a challenge, and for a number of reasons. Now, looking at these rules, we're going to consider a number of things, not too many, but first of all, we're going to consider the audience. We're going to consider the context. We're going to consider punctuation and the exact King James Bible wording. And I note that the King James Bible is not a version. It is a Bible that is in a line of Bibles that has been taken from the received text. And so that is our authority, not scholarship. And that tends to drive us in a different direction from scholarship. And I dare say, although cautiously, that even right division, there's scholarship in right division, so there'll be division amongst those that right divide if they want to go with what they think as opposed to what the Bible says. All right, so the importance, first of all, of the people addressed. And I'm taking this from Dr. David Cooper's, from the Biblical Research Group, his rules of interpretation. So David Cooper was a theologian, 1886, 1965, and he had put down some what he called rules of interpretation. We can't recommend everything that Dr. Cooper said, starting first of all with this notion of interpretation. I don't like to interpret. Joseph interpreted, Daniel interpreted, Jesus interpreted, Peter interpreted, even Paul spoke about interpretation. And interpretation is something that I think is beyond what really I can do today. I can strive to understand things, but to interpret things is beyond me. So what we'll prefer to do is go for understanding of the text of the Bible. So the audience being the first item. Oh, one other thing I will say about Dr. Cooper, and that is he also was in favor of the Revised Standard Version Bible as opposed to the King James Bible. Unfortunately, Dr. Cooper, along with many theologians at the time, was duped by Westcott and Hort and their manuscript, their Greek manuscript, which many theologians thought was a superior manuscript. And from it, we have editions of, or actually Bibles, including the New International, the American Standard, the Revised Standard, the New Revised Standard. All these Bibles are from Westcott and Hort. David Cooper thought that what Westcott and Hort did was better than the received text. We think that's an error. So we're going to stick with the King James Bible, the audience, people or object addressed. This is from David Cooper. To whom or what the words of a given passage are spoken. So that's the matter of the audience, to whom or what the words to whom they are spoken. Now we'll look at some examples of this. And we're going to take these examples from our study in Romans. So we see here in Romans 2:17, behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God. That tells me the audience here is a Jew. I'm not a Jew. So right away, I can see a difference in the addressed audience.
The Jews were among the audience.
They were, yeah, and Vivian's quite correct. In all fairness, the Jew were those that were in the overall audience, those in Rome to whom Paul was writing. And then in Romans 7:1, part B of verse 1, Paul writes, "For I speak to them that know the law." That would be the Jew, especially the Jew. I don't know the law as the Jew knew the law, so I would be less of an audience than those to whom Paul is speaking when he says, "I speak to them that know the law." Now, interesting, when we get to chapter 9, there's now some changes in the focus of the audience. We have now where Paul writes, "Even us, whom he hath called not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles." So now the audience is expanded to be both the Jews and the Gentiles, and specifically those called. And then in Romans 11, 13a, which is where we're going to be starting this study, Paul writes, "For I speak to you Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my office." So we can see how there has been a change in audience. So it's wise for me to pay attention to who is being addressed, who is the audience, because then I can tell what is to me or what is for me. The next consideration is the importance of context. And for the importance of context, rather than take from David Cooper, who had a very complicated statement and actually really didn't pay too much attention to context, we'll take this from the Oxford English Dictionary. So a context is a continuous text with parts duly connected. So the parts which immediately precede or follow any particular passage or text and determine its meaning. So that's circumstance. So that's the context. We'll talk about some examples to help this come to better clarity. Now, Romans 9. I'm going to ask Vivian to read this.
Romans chapter 9, verses 3 and 4. "For I wish that myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh, who are Israelites, to whom pertaineth the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the service of God and the promises."
So I can put together very quickly here that I see the audience is my brethren, and it's my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh. So that's interesting, not to be spiritualized. Paul is speaking about those who are Israelites. So two things I learned from this verse, these verses in chapter 9, is that the context are the Israelites, and the audience is his brethren, kinsmen according to the flesh. Now we'll see more here in chapter 10, verses 1 and 2.
Romans 10, verses 1 and 2. "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge."
Okay, so again, now I see the audience, again, is brethren, and I see the context, that is the text is concerning matters of Israel. And then one final one on context.
Romans 11, verse 1. "I say then, Hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin.
Okay, so again, chapter 11. And this is important now. This is valuable for going into and continuing on with chapter 11. The context concerns Israel, Israelites. Now we're going to take a look at the importance of punctuation. So we've considered audience, context, punctuation. Punctuation, we're going to look at 4 elements. The first element we'll look at is the comma. You say, wow, well, it's amazing just how often we just think a comma is nothing more than a pause. But actually the comma is used to make clear the sense of a passage by separating words into groupings. So a comma is to make clear by grouping words, not just a pause in my speaking. The next element we'll look at is the semicolon. And this is a poorly understood element in punctuation, and it is used to connect a thought. So we can say there's a thought, colon, or rather semicolon, and then an additional thought before the period. So we'll have some examples to look at that. The next element we'll look at is the colon. Now, the colon is another very poorly understood element of punctuation. It is used to introduce an illustration or an elaboration, an explanation of a preceding thought. So if we see a thought and then it ends with a colon, we know the words that follow the colon are actually introducing an explanation. So we'll watch for that. The colon is important. Then there is the period, which is a full stop. That means the end of the thought. Now there's other elements of punctuation that we're not going to deal with in this particular tutorial. There's the question mark. There's also the exclamation point. And the exclamation point does occur in chapter 11. And the exclamation point occurs very infrequently in all of the King James Bible. In fact, one of our listeners, Carlos, gave us a little bit of help in finding out how many times the exclamation point occurs in
Scripture,
in the entire King James Bible. And Carlos helped us find out that it occurs 313 times in 275 verses. Well, that's very little because there are over 31,000 verses in the King James Bible, and the exclamation point only occurs 313 times, 2 of which will be in this chapter. So thank you, Carlos, for helping us put that little bit together. Now, let's look at some examples of the use of punctuation. And the first example, this is just a group of words, just a secular sentence, group of words. And notice what's going to happen. First of all, we'll look at this sentence with nothing more than a period.
A woman without her man is nothing.
Okay, now I'm going to take that same group of words and I'm going to add some punctuation to it. Watch what happens to the understanding.
A woman without her man is nothing.
Isn't that interesting what a comma just did to that group of words? Now it is a woman without her man is nothing. Now we're going to change the punctuation. Watch what happens to the understanding.
A woman without her man is nothing.
Isn't that interesting? So now we've introduced the colon. So we know that the words following it are an explanation. So in other words, then we see a woman, colon, the explanation is without her, man is nothing. So that is the same group of words. Punctuation has dramatically changed the understanding of that group of words. So the point being, when we look at versions of the Bible, compared to the King James Bible, what happens to the punctuation, because we see that punctuation will impact understanding. So we're going to start now. We'll compare a passage, Romans 11, 13 and 14 in the King James. We're going to compare it to the same passage in the New International Version. So we'll have actually, well, actually, we'll pick our way through this. Yeah. So we have here, first of all, for I speak to you Gentiles, there's a comma in the King James Bible. In the New International Version, it says, I am talking to you Gentiles, period. So the New International wants me to think that's the end of the thought. I am talking to you Gentiles, end of thought. Whereas the King James Bible says, for I speak to you Gentiles, that's the first thought. And then, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, comma. And the NIV, well, to their credit, they agree with it. They put a comma in as well.
But it changes the meaning.
But it does change the meaning. And then we have in the King James, I magnify my office, colon. Whereas the New International, I take pride in my ministry, no punctuation. So because there's no punctuation, I have nothing to tell me that the words that follow the word, I take pride in my ministry, are an explanation to that group of words. Then we have in the King James that I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, comma. Whereas in the NIV, there's no comma. So the group of words are not identified. And then both end with a period. Okay, now we'll look again at another example, Romans 11:25, King James Bible, for I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be. And then the NIV says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not. And then back to the King James, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, semicolon, which says then that the words that follow now are a connected thought, not an explanation, but a connected thought. In the NIV, they insert a colon, which says then that these words are somehow supposed to be an explanation for the preceding group of words. So that changes dramatically the understanding. I'll move on. Then there's a comma in the King James Bible, happened to Israel, comma, whereas in the NIV, they don't bother with the comma. And then the verse 11:25 in the King James ends with a period, where in the NIV, the verse ends with a comma. So all of this has quite a difference in understanding if I pay attention to the punctuation. Now, we'll look at another example of exact wording. So this is from David Cooper again, from his Rules of Interpretation. We note the exact King James Bible wording, not the Revised Standard Version, which David Cooper thought was better. So we're going to consider the King James Bible. That is our authority, and we'll look at the exact wording of the text. And what David Cooper says, and this is very important, and I give credit for him saying this, I would that scholarship would pay attention to this. Every word, every group of words sets forth a definite, specific meaning. This is especially true of the scriptures, which are the profoundest of writings, which are more than the writings of uninspired men. So David Cooper says, analyze every word for its true meaning in any given text. So we appeal to the Oxford English Dictionary as the dictionary that is able to give us the definition of words as they were used at the time the King James Bible was put together. Now, we'll look at some examples of exact wording. We'll compare the King James Bible to the NIV. And we're going to start with, we'll look at Romans 11, 13, and 14 compared to the NIV, same verses. So Romans 11, 13, 14, it begins with, "For I speak to you Gentiles." Now notice in the NIV, it says, "I am talking to you Gentiles," period. Now the deletion of the word "for" disconnects the reader of the NIV from all the words that had been said prior to verse 13. When the King James Bible says "for," that is a continuance of the context where Paul is speaking to the Gentiles. So the NIV loses that completely. It just makes the assertion, "I am talking to you Gentiles," nothing to indicate to me continuity of context. Then we have the next phrase is, "Inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles," compared to "inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles." Well, how much difference can a little two-letter preposition make? Huge. The preposition "of" is a preposition which indicates relation, whereas the preposition "to," is a preposition which indicates direction. So I move to something. That is a direction, whereas being the apostle of the Gentiles indicates to the reader that Paul, his relationship was of the Gentiles. That's what was his focus. With them. So there's a big change then in understanding going from the word "of" to the word "to." And more of this will become clear as we go. Paul says, "I magnify mine office, : whereas the NIV says, "I take pride in my ministry." There's a big difference between magnifying one's office and taking pride in the ministry, and we'll examine that very carefully. Then we have, "Provoke to emulation them which are my flesh," compared to "arouse mine own people to envy." Dramatically different words. "Provoke to emulation them which are my flesh" is a very different understanding to "arouse my own people to envy." And we'll elaborate on that momentarily. And then to conclude the verse, the KJV ends verse 14 with, "and might save some of them," whereas the NIV simply says, "save some of them." Now, this word "might" is very significant, and "might save some of them" compared to just the NIV, "save some of them." That word "might" shows uncertainty. And with that word "might," in the King James Bible, see the King James Bible's inclusion of this one word, "might," in this verse destroys the doctrines of Calvinism and Universalism, because with this word "might," there are some that might and some that might not. So Calvinism and Universalism, or that is salvation of all, is completely destroyed by just the inclusion in the King James Bible of that word "might," because it shows the uncertainty. And Paul is speaking to the uncertainty that some might be saved and some might not be saved. He doesn't know. Okay, then look at this. Romans 12:6, King James Bible. The word prophecy shows up twice, once spelled with a C and once spelled with an S. Well, the definition of those words is different. Whereas in the NIV, prophecy is spelled with an S in both occurrences. Well, prophecy CY and prophecy SY, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, have different definitions. CY, prophecy spelled with a C, refers to prophecy that has been written. So the prophets wrote things down. With an S, speaks about is that prophecy which is spoken. So there were prophets then who read what was written, and then they spoke what was written. Whereas the NIV sees no difference in this, so we lose the continuity of what had been done by the prophets. It's only those things which are said. Okay, let's move along. Now, yes, can I not just read the Bible and let the Holy Spirit guide my spirit in understanding? So the Holy Spirit, capital S, guide my spirit, lowercase s, in understanding. Well, it's not any of our business to take away anybody's Bible and tell them that unless you do all this work, you shouldn't be reading the Bible. No, that if you want to sit down and relax and read the Bible and just meditate on the content, that's fine. And it's not our business to say otherwise. However, we do note that Paul gave very specific instructions to those that he called, including Timothy, where he said, study. And to do study, we know that's work, because 2 Timothy 2:15 says,
study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth.
So study is work. And Paul acknowledges that in terms of using the word, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed. So yes, it is work. So study is work. Then we have what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 3.
Ephesians chapter 3, verses 2 through 4. If ye have heard of the dispensation of the grace of God, which is given me to you ward, how that by revelation he made known unto me the mystery, as I wrote afore in few words, whereby, when ye read, ye may understand my knowledge in the mystery of Christ.
So isn't this interesting? I find that Paul says to read, and he says not to interpret, but he says understand, read and understand. So putting it all together, I am to study, I am to read and understand, not read and interpret. So my business is not to try to explain anything, but just to understand as well as we can the words, the English words in the text. All right. Now we're moving into the actual text. We're in Romans chapter 11, verses 13 through 15, slide 17 for those of you that have the copy on your desktop.
Romans 11, starting at verse 13. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles. I magnify mine office, if by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead?
Okay, so Paul says, for I speak to you Gentiles. Now the audience is identified, so the audience is the Gentiles. So the context is kinsmen according to the flesh who are Israelites. We learned that in chapter 9, verses 3 and 4. We also read, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God is for Israel, is that they might be saved. That's Romans 10:1. And then for context, finally, for I also am an Israelite. chapter 11, verse 1. So we know now the audience and the context. Inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. Now we've already elaborated that the preposition of is a preposition that expresses relation, not direction. It is the apostle of the Gentiles. Later on, Paul will say this, use the word to. So I magnify mine office, colon. Now, we'll follow the colon to verse 14 for the explanation as to what will magnify Paul's office. Now, notice, Paul's not talking about magnifying himself, as the NIV would have us to think that Paul takes pride here. No, Paul is focused on magnifying his office. And that magnify, that is an act to honor. So Paul strives to bring honor to the office to which he has been appointed. He's been called to this office as an apostle. He is as a good workman. He wants to bring honor to that office. If by any means I may provoke to emulation them. Now he talks about provoke. So provoke is a verb. It's a transitive verb, which means it needs to have an object, and the object would be them, that I may provoke to emulation them. Now, to provoke is to call forth. It's an invitation. He wants to invite, he wants to call to emulation them, and we know the audience are the Gentiles. So Paul says he wants to provoke them, which are my flesh. Note that. So these Gentiles are of his flesh, and might save some of them. Now, what would magnify, that is, what would be an act to honor to Paul's office? Not to Paul himself, but to the office. And our response is to have some, and I point again, to have some of the Gentiles in Rome to whom he is speaking become believers in his gospel. He was given a gospel. We know that very specifically from Galatians, and we know that from other of Paul's writings. He speaks about his gospel, and that gospel, his gospel, is identified in Romans chapter 1, verses 15 through 17. It is the gospel of Christ, wherein the righteousness of God is revealed. Paul maintains that these Gentiles, he says, that I may provoke to emulation them. Those Gentiles fit the context of being of Israel. The context of Israel was established in chapter 9, verses 3 and 4, 21 and 24, where Israel, they are the clay. There is one lump. It is called the same lump, and out of that same lump, there are both Jews called and Gentiles called. So from this, what I'm learning, and this completely flies in the face of what others are extracting from their understanding of the text, is that there are Gentiles who are actually of Israel. So what's a Gentile of Israel? A Gentile of Israel is an Israelite who is not circumcised. An uncircumcised Hebrew is a Gentile. There's anyone that is a Jew, all the Jews are circumcised. So in other words, it would be an oxymoron to say an uncircumcised Jew. All Jews are circumcised because the Jews are the religious, and they are the ones that observe the law. So the Jew was the circumcised. There are Hebrews, though, that are uncircumcised. They are of Israel. They are called Gentiles. And those of Israel knew the difference between their brethren that were circumcised and their brethren that were uncircumcised. And there was enmity between those groups. He talks about them being my flesh, Gentiles, provoking them to emulate him, my flesh. Now, the word emulation. Emulation from the Oxford English Dictionary is the endeavor to equal or surpass others in any achievement or quality. So what we take from this is that Paul is saying he wants to provoke, that is to invite, to urge these Gentiles of Israel to equal or surpass him. So there's the word provoke, equal or surpass him, which are his flesh. My flesh. Romans 9, we see my brethren, my kinsmen, according to the flesh. So there's no reason to spiritualize this. If I try to insert myself by spiritualizing the text, I'm doing it at my own peril, because there's nothing in the text here to tell me that I should just spiritualize this and make this apply to me when Paul is communicating something about Israel. Mm-hmm. And then he says, might save some of them. And we now know the importance of the word might. So Paul's objective concerning the Gentiles, and I'll call them now the Gentiles of Israel. There are other Gentiles. I am a Gentile of the nations, but then there are Gentiles of Israel. His objective was to provoke to emulation. That is, he's calling them, he's inviting them to follow him. And we see that in 1 Corinthians 11:1. Paul wanted to make himself an ensemble that they would follow him, his pattern, to the gospel of Christ. The gospel of Christ, not to the gospel of God. The gospel of Christ, which we learn in Romans chapter 1, verses 15, 16, and 17, is the gospel that includes the death, burial, and resurrection, and it is the gospel wherein the righteousness of God is revealed. Now, the gospel of God is the good news that Jesus is the Christ. That was the gospel that Peter preached. They were to follow the Christ, they were to follow Jesus into the kingdom. So the good news of the gospel of God is that Jesus is the fulfillment of all those promises. Now, Paul wants these Gentiles to emulate him, to follow him in the gospel of Christ. This is the gospel whereby one is saved, sealed, and seated in the heavenly places. Gentiles of the nations, then, so that would include me now, because I am a Gentile. We're Gentiles of the nations. Genesis 10:5 would be those that would follow the Gentiles of Israel, which had moved from their unbelief to belief in the gospel of Christ. So what I learned here is the first ones on the bus are the Gentiles of Israel. They're the first ones to be saved.
Through Paul's gospel.
Through Paul's gospel of the gospel of Christ. I came subsequently. I came after these Gentiles got on the bus and were then preaching the gospel of Christ. I and the people from whom I descended were saved subsequent to them.
But including through the Acts period.
And we're going to cover that. It'll be right through the Acts period this happens. So Paul says, provoke to emulation them, Gentiles, which are my flesh, to save some of them. So this is a rather stunning thing to understand, that we have Gentiles here which are of Israel. I'm gonna also share with you that we're beginning to see evidence that there are others that have also seen this and have written about it. I've shared with you that we have a couple of listeners in Norway. That would be Oddman and Solvi. Sorry, Oddman and Solvi. I probably messed up your names. But they have already shared with us that there was a Bible teacher there in Norway that has since passed away. And in some of his Norwegian writings and the things that he had put together, he too had observed that there were Gentiles which were of Israel. Now, we look at verse 15. For if the casting away of them, that would be the Gentiles of Israel, I have to be very careful with these words, the casting away of them. This is not to say they're being thrown away. The casting away of them, that's the Gentiles of Israel, be the reconciling of the world. What shall the receiving of them, that would be again the Gentiles of Israel, but life from the dead? So let me share with you Hosea chapter 2, verse 23.
Hosea 2:23. And I will sow her unto me in the earth, and I will have mercy upon her that had not obtained mercy. And I will say to them which were not my people, Thou art my people. And they shall say, Thou art my God.
Now, what we're going to take a look at here is these words, sow her unto me in the earth. And who is he sowing unto me in the earth but them which were not my people? Well, that seems to be, well, this is what the casting away of them is. They're being sown into the earth. The uncircumcised.
For centuries.
For centuries, the Gentiles of Israel, the uncircumcised of Israel, have been by God sown into the earth. So these two phrases, casting away of them, this is like casting seed. They're being sown into the earth. Thou art my people. Then what happens is when this thing comes together, they will then become, thou art my people, and they shall say, thou art my God. Now let's look again. For if the casting away of them, that would be the Gentiles of Israel, be the reconciling of the world. So because they were sown into the earth, the world has been reconciled. What shall the receiving of them, those Gentiles of Israel, be but life from the dead? Now, the receiving life from the dead. We noticed a connection last time. We noticed the connection with the lost son parable, which we would call, otherwise known as the prodigal son parable. So the lost son parable and the conclusion by the father regarding the younger son. This is the son that had gone out from the father's property, from his home. In Luke 15:32.
Luke 15:32. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother, the younger brother, was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found.
So this is the father now. So the parable is found in Luke chapter 15, and Luke chapter 15 here in this verse, we have the father who is speaking to the older son, who's not very happy. In fact, the older son, consistent with the thought that we've shared, that there was enmity between the circumcised and the uncircumcised. The older brother was not happy with the younger brother, and the father says to the older brother that we should make merry and be glad. Why? For this thy brother, the younger one, was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. So look at this, alive again. Paul says, alive from the dead. This thy brother. So here we have the uncircumcised returning in faith. Then Paul writes to us,
Colossians 2:13, and you, being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses.
Okay, so what Paul is sharing here in Romans is consistent with what is said in the Gospels and the parable. And then Paul writes to those in Colossae that we were dead in sins. I was dead in sins and the uncircumcision of flesh, and he hath quickened together with him, and we are forgiven all trespasses. Now, we're going to look back briefly because at Romans 11:12, because in 11:12, we saw the other side of the parable of the prodigal son, which was what was the result for the older son. So we read here in Vivian in Romans 11:12.
Romans 11, verse 12. Now, if the fall of them, that is Israel by works, now if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness?
Okay, so now Israel fell because they sought righteousness not by faith, but by works. So there was the fall. Now notice there's a semicolon, how much more their fullness. So now we want to find out about this matter of fullness. We look at now the prodigal son and the conclusion for the elder son.
Luke 15, verse 31. And he said unto him, the elder son, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine.
So the conclusion for the elder son, now this is a son that stayed with the father and did all the things that the father served the father and obeyed the father. All that I have is thine. This is earthly. How much more their fullness? So Paul says in Romans 11:12, Israel by works, which would be analogous to the elder son, their fullness, all that I have is thine. So Israel's fullness, when is it going to occur? That fullness is when they recover from their fall of striving to attain righteousness by works. That's their error, trying to achieve righteousness by works, by being good. In fact, we still hear that amongst the Hebrews today, to this present day. The Hebrew mindset is that we should be good people. Now, let's move on to 11, verses 16 to 18.
Romans chapter 11, starting at verse 16. For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee.
Right. So we'll move into now verse 16, the first part of it. So where Paul writes, for if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. So this word holy, I know there's a popular notion that it means sinless, but more than that, holy really does point to something that is kept from ordinary use, or that which is dedicated, something that has been set apart. So the first fruit was set apart. It was dedicated to something. And then because the first fruit was set apart, was dedicated, the lump is also set apart. It also is dedicated.
Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 3a. Israel was holiness unto the Lord, and the first fruits of his increase.
Okay, so my note here to share with you is that Israel was holiness, That is, it was set apart, it was dedicated, and the first fruits be holy. So that it cuts both ways, the first fruits and of Israel. It's all dedicated to God. The first fruits are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then the lump, the root, and branches are all holy. They're all set apart. They're all holy. They're all dedicated to God. All Israel is set apart unto the Lord. Now, this is not to say that Israel is perfect or that Israel is sinless. What it's saying is that everything of Israel is set apart to the Lord, to Jehovah God. You can say, like, guys have garages, and in the garage, everything that's in the garage belongs to the guy. Some of it is stuff that is good, and some of it is stuff which is no good, but it all belongs to the guy that owns the garage. That's the way it goes. So Israel, whatever it is all set apart, and there's no change. This is God's plan. Then there's a colon, where the colon, so now we have an explanation. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. So we know the first fruit is holy, the lump is holy, and therefore, and if the root be holy, so are the branches.
Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek. And his rest shall be glorious.
Okay, so then we have this word, there'll be a root of Jesse, which will stand for an ensign of the people. That word ensign really is defined as a sign. So there's going to be a root of Jesse that will stand for an ensign. What is this root of Jesse that stands for an ensign of the people? And since it's Isaiah, a prophet of Israel, this is something to Israel. It is the seed of David, the root of Jesse, the seed of David, which is Jesus. Romans 15:12.
Romans 15:12. And again, as saith, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he that shall rise to reign over the Gentiles. In him shall the Gentiles trust.
Okay, now it's true, I am a Gentile, but the focus here is the Gentiles of Israel. And it is the Gentiles of Israel that will trust in Jesus. We follow. We are on the same bus. I just have to be comfortable with the fact that I'm in the back of the bus. I'm not up at the front, and I'm certainly not driving the bus. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. Jeremiah 2:3 again.
Jeremiah 2, verse 3a, Israel was holiness unto the Lord, and the first fruits of his increase.
Okay, so it's Israel. Israel was holiness. Israel was dedicated. This is not to say that Israel was perfect, but God chose them. They are the ones that were dedicated to Jehovah God. All Israel is holiness. All Israel is set apart unto the Lord, whether circumcised or uncircumcised. Let me elaborate. You'll say, well, what about Genesis 17:14? So Genesis 17:14 reads,
Genesis 17:14, and the uncircumcised man-child whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people.
So you go, aha, you see that? If they're uncircumcised, they're cut off. Well, the text says, cut off from his people, not cut off from Jehovah God. That's huge. He's cut off from the people, not cut off from God. And the Jews, the circumcision, the Jews, they knew that the uncircumcised were cut off, and they treated them as those that had been cut off. But they still are Israel. They still belong to God. We look now at 17, verse 17, the first part of it. And if some of the branches be broken off, now this word broken. That word broken is separated forcibly into parts, fragments, pieces. That's from the Oxford English Dictionary. Some of the branches be broken off. Now notice that broken can include that which can be healed. So some of the branches were broken off. There is potential for healing here. Luke 4:18.
Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted.
So my note here is that branches broken off will, under a condition, be grafted back in again. Now we'll see that. We still have a ways to go to see how that will work, but in verse 23, we'll see the condition under which branches that were broken off will be grafted back in again. Now, and thou being a wild olive tree, verse 17, we're continuing, thou being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. So grafted, today we use the word graft. It's to graft is to insert a twig into a different stock. So that's what grafting is, or grafted. So a wild olive tree is still an olive tree. An olive tree speaks of Israel. So we have a wild olive tree, and a wild olive tree is a tree, an olive tree growing in a state of nature. Liz would know this. A tree growing in a state of nature, it's not cultivated. Everything in Liz's garden is being cultivated. But this is a wild olive tree. It's outside of where trees are being cultivated. And we're talking now about those that are from a wild olive tree are being grafted in. And they're grafted in among them with them partakest of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. So these are all olive branches, some cultivated, some wild, and they are now joined into these wild olive branches, now are grafted into the olive tree that is holy, and now is partaking in the root and the fatness of the olive tree. The nutrition of that tree. Semicolon. Boast not against the branches. So the instruction to these Gentiles of Israel, the Gentiles, is don't boast against the branches that were broken off. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. So here's a warning to the Gentiles of Israel not to boast against those branches that were broken off. Now we'll compare this to Romans 2:17, because the Jew who was circumcised, and again, there's no such thing as an uncircumcised Jew. All Jews are circumcised. Romans 2:17.
Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God.
Okay, so there's boasting going on both sides of Israel. The uncircumcised are boasting because they're being grafted in, and the other branches that are broken off, well, they made their boast because they rested in the law. They were keeping the law. And in fact, we'll just look at this for a moment here. We're going to look again at the parable of the prodigal son. The Jew made a boast of their keeping of the commandments. So the elder son of the parable of the lost son, or the prodigal son, is an example of such a boast. Here's the boast.
Luke 15:29. And he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment.
So there's the boast. The elder son was criticizing the younger son who had not served and who had transgressed the commandments of the father. The elder son This is Israel, is making a boast. I serve thee and I follow your commandments. So the Gentiles boasted against the Jews because they were branches broken off, and the Jews made their boast about their service to God.
And those Gentiles have been grafted in without doing anything
Yeah,
at all.
I know, I know. And that was the complaint of the elder son. As soon as this your son is returned, you're making a party for him.
Yeah, your son.
Your son.
Not
He said,
my brother.
not my brother, but your son. Your son returns, and you make a party for him.
It's a blame job.
Yeah. So we can see this helps to illuminate what our understanding of Ephesians chapter 2, when Paul is writing about the enmity between them.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
Just to clarify a little bit, where it says some of the branches be broken off. So you're saying that these branches broken off are the Jews?
Yeah, these branches broken off are the Jews
Who
were not believing the righteousness of God being revealed in the gospel of Christ. So they were going about to establish their own righteousness.
Right. They weren't believing that Messiah had come.
Yes.
Their Messiah had come.
Yes.
They didn't believe.
There were different levels, really. They could just reject out and out that Jesus was Messiah.
Yeah.
But they could also be saying, well, Peter's gospel is what,
Yeah. But
they were boasting in the law.
They were boasting in the law, but what they didn't believe was where the righteousness of God is revealed. And the first part of Romans, Paul spends really his entire focus that there is no work that is going to make you righteous. But the Jew was persistent in thinking that their good service, their faithfulness in just doing the work, was sufficient to make them righteous before God. We see that continuing to this very day, that there are people that think if I just do good, God will be impressed and consider me righteous.
And this was what Paul experienced when he went up to Jerusalem, and those with James were zealous of the law.
They were zealous of the law. Acts 21:21.
Yeah.
Okay, so now it goes on to say, I'm just trying to get this clear in my mind. It goes on to say that thou, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree. So the Gentiles, being the wild olive tree, does that mean that the Jews were grafted back in?
The branches, well, let me say specifically that the Gentiles
were cut out of their wild olive tree.
Were cut out of the wild olive tree
and grafted into.
And brought over to, they were now being part of the cultivated olive tree, wherein was the fatness and the root. So that's where the nutrition would come to them.
Okay, so this is like a tree without a root then.
It has a root.
No, the root.
No, but it says that they're grafted in among them and partakes of the root.
They're grafted in among those of believing Israel, where the ones who rejected the Messiah were cut off from that cultivated olive tree. Were broken off, I'm sorry. The branches were broken off.
If we look in verse 16, it says, for if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And then there's a colon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Planning it says, and if the root be holy, and it says if the root is holy and the root are the same thing.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The root, actually, there's a difference. The root is separated. The root is dedicated unto the Lord. So the root is holy in that it is separated to God.
And those were all the people starting with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes. They were all set apart unto God.
Now, the wild olive tree there's no the root there. There is no root there that is dedicated, no root that is holy. They
Sorry,
have,
I meant to say that the root is the first fruit. Right?
yes, yes.
The first fruit and the root are the same thing.
The first fruit come from the root.
Yeah, I would see it as a progression. But Liz, let's explore this when we get
In
to
our
to
second
the next hour, because I think you're raising some good points, and we should explore it, give some time to it. Okay, so what we want to pick up here is about the elder son. So this would be the Jew who continues to serve God, but is doing it without believing God. So there's a difference here. There's these two different boasts.
Not resting in the Lord, not resting in God, but resting in the law.
Yes. Okay, so now we're going to look at verses 19 through 22.
Romans 11, starting at verse 19. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee, goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise, thou also shalt be cut off.
Okay, so looking at verse 19, thou wilt say then, so this would be those that were of the wild olive tree, they will say, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. So the Gentiles' thinking is incorrect. Paul is going to correct their thinking. They weren't broken off specifically for the Gentiles to be grafted in, but that's what the Gentiles are thinking. Paul says, well, semicolon, connected thought, because of unbelief, they were broken off. And thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. So Hebrews 3:18, this is true also of the wilderness journey.
Hebrews 3:18 and 19. And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believed not? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief.
So the matter here, the issue here is unbelief. And the branches that were broken off, that would be those Jews that were broken off because of unbelief. Now, this is rather significant because the Jews were the ones who said that they believed God. They were the religious ones, but yet in all their claims of believing God, they didn't believe God. And because they didn't believe and went about to establish their own righteousness by their own ways, Paul says, they're broken off.
And the law couldn't save them.
Yeah.
The law just showed their sin.
Yeah. So exactly. So Paul says, be not high-minded. Now he's talking now to the branches that are grafted in. Be not high-minded. That is to say, don't be haughty or proud or arrogant, but fear. And then there's a colon. But fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. So what's this about? Because Paul says, take heed, where he's saying, listen up. So Paul is going to correct in verse 22, he's going to correct the Gentile understanding. He's going to make it correct. Behold, therefore, the goodness of God, the goodness that is the manifestation of benevolence. God was goodness, that is benevolent towards the Gentiles. Ephesians 2, verses 4 and 5.
Ephesians 2, verses 4 and 5. But God, who is rich in mercy, for his great love wherewith he loved us, even when we were dead in sins, hath quickened us together with Christ. By grace ye are saved.
Okay, so it's grace. Grace is that benevolence. So there's the goodness, the benevolence of God. By grace are ye saved. And then there's the severity of God. Severity, colon, on them which fell severity. Severity is strictness and sternness in dealings. So this strictness and sternness under the law, God was strict. You either obeyed the law or you were in deep trouble. Now, Leviticus 26, 14 and 16.
Leviticus 26, verse 14. But if ye will not hearken unto me, and will not do all these commandments, and verse 16, I also will do this unto you. I will even appoint over you terror, consumption, and the burning ague that shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart.
Okay, so the burning ague is like a very bad sickness. So if you will not listen to me, if you will not hearken to me, I will do this unto you. So there is the severity of God. Sternness in dealings. Goodness of God, goodness. If thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou shalt also be cut off. The connected thought. If thou continue, otherwise the cut off. So cut off. The cut off is an interruption or stopping of a continuance. Now let's note 2 Timothy 4, 14 and 15, where Paul is speaking to Timothy about Alexander the coppersmith.
2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. The Lord reward him according to his works. Of whom be thou ware also, for he hath greatly withstood our words.
Okay, so Alexander the coppersmith was saved, but he did much evil towards Paul. Now let's look at 1 Corinthians 3, verses 13 through 15.
1 Corinthians 3, starting at verse 13. Every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire. And the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. And if any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward.
So we note, and one more verse.
And if any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire.
So there is a cutoff, suffering loss. And now notice the focus is on work. If every man's work, every man's work. If any man's work abide, if any man's work shall be burned. So this is the matter, that they were to continue in his goodness in order for the for their rewards to follow. Now we note here back again, 2 Timothy 4, 14 and 15 about Alexander the coppersmith. What did Paul say? He says, he did me much evil. The Lord reward him according to what? His works. So it's not loss of salvation. What this is, these are the implications of the loss of reward for those saints who are saved, sealed, and seated, but yet, if they're not faithful in the work that they are called to do, they can suffer loss. All right, we will stop here at Romans 11:23 and pick up at this point here where we will now see about the condition under which those branches that were broken off can be grafted back in again. So we'll pick up next time at Romans 11:23.